come and share with us the Word.
All right. Well, good to see everyone back tonight. I got a little worried earlier today. Brother Lilly was talking about the old people. And I honestly got a little tickled. I was sitting back there kind of laughing at it. And then he said my name, and then it wasn't so funny anymore. Oh, well, it's good to be at church. It's good to laugh and have a good time.
Amen.
And to enjoy the things of life. And no sense in getting upset about those things, is there? Just laugh about it, move on, and enjoy things. Well, had an adventure on the way to church tonight. We were coming in, and this morning there was a little bit of the car shut off on me on the way down the mountain. And it started right back up. No big deal. I'm not worried about those things. I have fun. To me, it's an adventure. I enjoy the challenge. It's not a big deal. Some of y'all don't like those ideas and those unexpected. I love them. They're fun. And got back. In fact, I teased Byron and Sandy when we were leaving this morning. I said, well, I hope it starts for us to go home. And they sat and waited till we got going before they left. And we had no problem. Well, we were driving back down the mountain tonight, and every curve coming down the mountain, the car shut off. Every curve it shut off. And I looked down, and every time, and those of you who remember driving vehicles back in the 90s and 80s and stuff, you know, technology wasn't the greatest, and what I think's going on is when the gas sloshes, it doesn't get picked up by the fuel pump, and so it shuts off. So every time we ran around the corner, it basically ran out of gas. So I said, well, that means I've got to keep more gas in it than what I was keeping in there. So don't let it run on empty. That's a bad idea. But we had fun. We stopped at the gas station when we got to the bottom of the mountain, put a little gas in it, and made it on to church. So, but I love it. I enjoy it, and I've had so much fun with that, and it doesn't bother me one bit. It's part of the journey. It's part of life, and doesn't bother me at all. I like the challenge of it. So we'll dive into figuring out what that problem is and fix that, or we'll just live with it and drive it and not worry about it, and just keep gas in it, right? Don't let it get below half a tank. I had a truck in college that would give me problems with gas gauges, and I quit trusting them after that. Well, Mark chapter 11, verse 1 through 19, we begin into, and I've never done this before. It's a first for me, but I'm going to entitle a series the rest of the end of Mark. We're going to call it Journey to the Cross, and then we'll break it down into different sections as we go through there. And tonight we'll look at entering Jerusalem is what I entitled it tonight as we get into Mark chapter 11. I thought it was interesting as I noticed the timing as we get into this, and then Easter's coming up. But I'm not going to go through the next 5 chapters by Easter, because Easter's only 2 Sundays away, and I don't think we can do that. And I don't want to buzz through this so fast that we miss things as we go along. But at the same time, as I was studying this passage out and looking into this first section where Jesus enters into Jerusalem, I was going into that, and I was, wow, there's just so much going on to fill in and to look at, and what's happening. And you don't want to cut things out as you go through there. But at the same time, we don't want to bog down in it. And so we're going to go through it. And if I miss something, well, don't get too upset. Because I know some of y'all went through the summer module on the resurrection, and y'all know all about it. So after tonight, you can give me all your notes, and then I'll use them for the next sermon. I was teasing Miss Winnie and Brother Ronnie about it, and I said, now don't go critiquing my sermon tonight, because you guys, and Ronnie said, I didn't go through that, so I didn't have to worry. I was like, oh, okay. So those of you who did, don't be a little easy on me, okay? Take it easy on me. But the journey to the cross, entering into Jerusalem, we begin in chapter 11, verse number 1. It says, and when they came nigh to Jerusalem unto Bethphage and Bethany, at the Mount of Olives, he sendeth forth 2 of his disciples. And that's interesting. I was reading that verse and trying to get my mind wrapped around this scene and what's going on, and I found a great picture. If Brother Byron can put that up for you. Is that up on the screen? Yeah, there it is. And so they had a nice little drawing and idea of the journey from Bethany all the way into Jerusalem, and the idea through and looking at this and thinking about it and looking at this picture and getting my mind's eye wrapped around Jesus going into Jerusalem from that side and what was happening in his mind. Now remember, up to this point, he's mentioned to the disciples several times that he was going to go to the cross, that he was going to be put to death. In fact, in chapter 10 and verse 33 and 34, it said, "Behold, we go up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man shall be delivered unto the chief priests and unto the scribes, and they shall condemn him to death, and shall deliver him to the Gentiles, and they shall mock him, and shall scourge him, and shall spit upon him, and shall kill him, and the third day he shall rise again." That's going through their minds as they're walking along that path. As they're going through, they get around through the Mount of Olives there, and they see Jerusalem, and you know that's going into Jesus' mind. What is about to happen? He knows what's going on. He knows what's happening next. Some of the disciples may be realizing it, or maybe thinking on the words that Jesus had spoke there earlier about this death and what's going to happen, and the scribes and Sadducees and all them taking, the chief priests taking him and killing him and mocking him and all those things happening to him. And you kind of wonder if some of them were going, why are we going to Jerusalem then? Why bother going? If they're going to do this, why should we go? Because if we knew what hurt was coming to us, we wouldn't go there, right? That we generally, if we know harm's way, harm is down that path, you know what? I'm going to go that way. That's typically what we would do. But I'm so thankful that Jesus didn't do that. He went to the cross. He went into Jerusalem just as we sang the songs tonight at the cross, and Jesus dying on it and shedding his blood, and especially this the last one we sang at the cross, that first verse, and when it did, would he devote that sacred head for such a worm as I? You know, I remember singing that as a kid and thinking about that, and thinking about, Jesus didn't have to die for me. He didn't have to go down that path into Jerusalem to die for me, but yet he did. And he did it for everyone in the whole world. It's such a wonderful thought to have. Amen. And a wonderful way to look at it. But as we enter into this journey and we go into it, the first thing we notice is it's fulfilling prophecy. It's fulfilling prophecy. If you have your Bibles open, turn over to Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 9. We're just going to look at one verse of prophecy. We're not going to go into a whole bunch of them. I've got to leave something for you to do when you get home. If I give you everything, then you won't have anything to do when you get home, right? So many times we like to sit and you give me the information so I don't have to do the work, right? That's what we like. It happens at work all the time. We don't want to. We joke around. The units we install come with instruction manuals, and nobody wants to read the manual. We want to call somebody else to tell us the answer because nobody wants to go and read the manual. Well, I'm going to let you read the manual on a few things. I'm not going to give you all the answers. But Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9 says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just, and having salvation, lowly, and riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass." And we're going to look at that prophecy here in just a few minutes as we go down through chapter 11. So keep that in mind. So fulfilling prophecy. Later in our notes, as we notice that they stop at Bethany. Now, we don't have the exact town. We know they were, and you saw on the map the two small towns there where they were stopping at. I kind of suspect, and I put Bethany down, and the reason I suspect that is if you go over to John chapter number 12. If you go to John chapter number 12, and John's account of what takes place here, as they go into this area, and I suspect that they stopped in Bethany because of John 12, it says, "Then Jesus, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany where Lazarus was, which had been dead, whom he raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served. But Lazarus was one of them that sat at the table with him. Then took Mary a pound of ointment and spackled and very costly, and anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the odor of the ointment. Then saith one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, which should betray him, Why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor? Thus he said not that he cared for the poor, but because he was the thief and he had the bag. It tells you a little bit about people and money, doesn't it? And bear what was put therein. Then said Jesus, let her alone. Against the day of my burying hath she kept this. For the poor always ye have with you, but me ye have not always. And so as we look through that and we see this passage here, and I suspect that they decided to stay in Bethany. They evidently stopped at Mary and Martha's house and Lazarus and ate dinner with them and spent some time with them. And Mary anoints Jesus' feet. And what a wonderful scene that was. And so I kind of suspect that's where Jesus decided to stay. And as we go through this account here in chapter 11, we're going to see Jesus doesn't stay in Jerusalem. He leaves Jerusalem and then comes back into the city as we go down through here. So here they stop in there, and then a command is given. Number one, as we see this stopping in at Bethany, we see a command given. In the command to obtain a colt, here in verses 2 down through verse 3, it says, and he saith unto him, go your way into the village over against you, and as soon as ye have entered into, ye shall find a colt tied, whereon never man sat. Loose him and bring him. And if any man say unto you, why do ye this? Say ye that the Lord hath need of him, and straightway he will send him hither. Man, what a command. Here Jesus tells these two disciples to go into the town, whichever one it was, and to obtain a colt that's tied up and nobody's ever sat on him. Now, I've thought about that. How many of you have rode horses before in here? Okay. How many of you have ever been thrown off of a horse? How many of you have rode an unbroke horse before and tried to break it? Okay. Yeah, I've had my experiences of those. I've dealt with colts before. They're not fun. On horses, not donkeys. I haven't dealt much with donkeys. But it's so interesting to me that they said here, Jesus tells them, go in and get this colt that's tied up that nobody's ever sat on for me to ride into Jerusalem. And the power that Jesus had over creation. And we've seen it time and time again as we go through here. And the disciples go in and they find this colt tied up. And no, in my mind, I guess I'm just too comical sometimes. But as I think about it, I think about the two disciples going in. Well, Jesus told us to go get the colt, so we're going to go find a colt. And then we find one, and it's tied up. And then, all right, who wants to try to drag this thing out of the city? Because it's probably not going to come. Somebody's going to have to get behind and push it. Somebody's going to have to drag it and pull it. And that's kind of where I wonder if these disciples were having this conversation and trying to decide who's going to pull it and who's going to push it. You know, how are we going to get this thing to come with us? Because it's never been rode on. It's probably not tame. This is going to be difficult. I remember one summer up at the camp we were working and dealing with horses. And one of the mares had a colt, and his name was Rusty. I didn't really like Rusty, and Rusty didn't like me too much. And we were trying, he was still pretty young, and we were trying to catch him. And I had caught him, and I had a lead rope on him. And he decided he was going to drag me beside a fence, and I decided I wasn't going to get drugged beside the barbed wire fence. And I let go of the lead rope. Well, when I did, I tripped. And when I tripped, he kicked me in the side of the head. And that's what's wrong with me, in case anybody was wondering. So now you know. And I think about, when I read this, I think about those things and how difficult of a task this could have been. But when you look at it, it says, and we will go into it, we see number 2 is the obedience to the command. Thinking about the difficultness of that command, and yet we see the obedience of it in verse 4 and 5. It says, and they went their way and found the colt tied by the door without in a place where two ways met, and they loosed him. And certain of them that stood there said unto him, why do you loose the colt? And they say unto them, even as Jesus had commanded, and they let them go. Wow, what an amazing scene. Here are the disciples. There's the colt. That's not a surprise. Jesus told us to come in and get one, so we knew there would be one. So they get it, they loose it, and they begin to take it away, and there's men standing there. It doesn't say it was the owner, just says there were men, and asked, why do you loose the colt? So our master had need of it. Okay, they let him go their way. And thinking about that, that wasn't something, if I had a horse tied up in front of my house and some strangers came over and started to take it off, that's not the conversation I'm going to have with them. Your master said you needed it. Well, let's call your master. I need to talk to him for a minute. It's so amazing as we see this unfolding. And as things progress and as things go along, how when Jesus tells us to do something, I was reading that and thinking about, when God tells us to do something, sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes it looks like a difficult task. But yet, when we obey and we go into it and we start doing it, how easy it turns into sometimes. Not all the time. Sometimes it's difficult. But sometimes it's like it flows. It's like everything worked out. Have you ever done that? Where God tells you to do something and you go through it and you get done and you go, I couldn't have done that any better. In fact, if I tried to, I would have made a mess of that. But yet God works things out and everything falls into place and it works out beautifully. And we're so excited when we see it. And yet we read it in the Bible and we're surprised when it happens in our life. It's such an amazing thing. We see this stopping in at Bethany. And then look, letter B in our notes, at the preparation for entering Jerusalem. There in verse 7 down through verse 8. It says, and they brought the colt to Jesus and cast their garments on him, and he sat upon him. And they spread their garments in the way, and others cut down branches of trees and strewed them in the way. Such an amazing scene. Here the disciples, they bring the colt back to Jesus. They put their coats on him, and Jesus just gets on the colt. Doesn't buck, doesn't fuss, doesn't fight him. I've been on horses that have never been broke before, and I thought I was going to the moon. I mean, that's just what it felt like. But yet this doesn't happen. Jesus gets on him, and they begin to go along the way, and other people see and they recognize who Jesus is. And let's let her see in our notes as the acknowledgement of who Jesus is. They take their coats off and they begin to lay them in the way. They begin to cut palm tree branches down and laying them in the way because Jesus is coming. The King is coming, the Messiah. They recognized who He was. They acknowledged who Jesus is. In verse 9 through 10, we see that even more. It says, and they went before, and they that followed cried, saying, Hosanna, blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. Blessed be the kingdom of our father David, who cometh in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. They recognized who Jesus is. They acknowledged who Jesus is. What an amazing scene here. But yet we look at this and think, oh, they're going to accept him. Can you imagine the disciples thinking, oh, okay, so he's not really going to die. The people are accepting him. He's going to come in as the Messiah. And maybe some mixed emotions going on as this scene unfolds. As things begin to progress, the emotions might get a little high and get a little excited. The people are expecting Jesus to come in and take over and be the Messiah and be the King and rule and reign and set up His kingdom at this time. It doesn't happen, but that's what it seems like they're expecting it as they go through here. And it's wonderful to see that they're crying out, Hosanna, blessed be the kingdom of our father, or David, that cometh in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest. It kind of carries the idea of long live the king, is part of some phrasing involved with this. What an amazing scene here and the acknowledgement of it. And then as we go down to letter D in verse number 11, we see Jesus as He rides into Jerusalem on the back of the colt, and the people are crying Hosanna. And then we get to verse 11, and it says, and Jesus entered into Jerusalem and into the temple. And when He had looked around about upon all things, and now the eventide was come, He went out unto Bethany with the 12. I've always thought that was so interesting, because why go into Jerusalem riding on a colt at the eve time? They ride in, and the crying out, Hosanna, the King is here, and the kingdom of David is here, and so on. All this is taking place. He goes into the temple, He looks around, and then He leaves. Why do that? Such an interesting thought as we go down through here and as we look at it. Verse 11 was interesting. Why go into the temple and look around and then leave? And I think as we go into that, I'll look at something here when we get down to verse 15 that may answer that question as to why He did that. And then as we move along, we get into verse 12 and 13 and 14. And my Bible does a little paragraph split here and another narrative. And as we go down through this, we see the next day happens. And on the morrow when they were come from Bethany, he was hungry. And I entitled this section, The Fig Tree, Part 1. Because the fig tree gets brought up again, but we wouldn't have time to get into it tonight. So I just entitled this Part 1. We'll look at Part 2 next week, Lord willing. And then we'll reference back to this. But it says that he came the next day from Bethany, and he was hungry. Well, we see the humanity of God there, Jesus, as he's hungry. He was hungry just like we get hungry. And as he hungers, verse 13 says, he seeing a fig tree afar off, having leaves, he came, if happily he might find anything thereon, and when he come to it, he found nothing but leaves, for the time of the figs were not yet. And Jesus answered and said unto it, No man eat fruit of thee hither forever. And his disciples heard it. You read that and you think, boy, that's odd. That's interesting. Okay, Jesus comes to it, and I was reading through this, and he's hungry. He sees the fig tree and it has leaves on it, so he goes over hoping that that he might find a thing thereon, is what it says. And then it says that he finds nothing but leaves, for the time of the figs was not yet. So he was hoping to find something. There might be something there, but it wasn't time for the figs to be there. And he doesn't find any, and then he curses the tree because it doesn't have any. And I thought, well, that's a little odd. So I had to go digging into this a little bit. How many of you have ever looked into the fig tree? Okay, I thought there might be a few of you have. This is really interesting. So I got digging into this fig tree and trying to understand why this happened the way it did. And as I dug into it, I found that the fig tree produces a breba fig in the early spring around April or May. These figs are ones that were ready to grow before the plant goes dormant for the winter. The breba figs begin to grow before leaves appear. They're little buds that come out, according to my research that I found. They are edible. They have a pleasant, light sweetness or jammy, rich flavor, though they can occasionally be less flavorful than the main crop in certain varieties. So when Jesus came to this, he was expecting to find those little buds on this tree that were from the year before, that this tree should have had on it, but it didn't have them. It didn't produce enough last year. It wasn't cultivated enough. It didn't do its job the year before it went dormant. And so when he comes to it at this time and the leaves are there should already be these little buds of figs on there that they could have eaten, but they weren't there. And Jesus finds them. So letter A in verse 12 and 13, we find he's looking for fruit. He's looking for fruit. And a lot of times we look at these passages and we can make a really good application in our own lives of Jesus coming and looking for fruit in our life. And we'll reference back to this later on next week, Lord willing, as something happens to the fig tree later on. But he's looking for fruit. And I was reading through this and thinking, how many times does Jesus come looking for fruit in our lives? And yeah, we have the leaves, right? We have the nice clothes. We carry our Bible. Some people we got it laid up in the dash of the car or wherever. We got it laid there in the seat. We have the tracts in the car. We have all of it. We're listening to gospel music, and we're doing all these things, and we look good. We have the leaves, but there's no fruit. There's nothing being produced in our lives for Christ. And he's looking for that fruit. And then verse 14 says, as we read there, and Jesus answered and said unto it, No man eateth fruit of thee hither forever. And his disciples heard it. I put down letter B as finding no fruit in verse 14. What a scary thought. When Jesus comes up and he sees this tree, there's no fruit on it. Should have been something if it was doing its job, if it was producing like it's supposed to. There should have been some kind of fruit, something to give evidence that it was a healthy tree. There wasn't any. And Jesus says, No man eat fruit of thee hither forever. And I was reading that and thought, oh man, that's a scary thought in an application in my life. If Jesus comes and looks at my life and says, you're not producing any fruit, so you're not going to be useful anymore. That's a scary thought to have as you look at this, finding no fruit. So just some thoughts there as we go and look at this fig tree as Jesus passes by it. And we'll leave that alone until we get to it later on down in verse 20, and we'll come back and look at it again. But just an application I wanted to make on this account as Jesus looks at this fig tree and he's looking for fruit. Then we get down to verse number 15, down through verse number 19. And as this account goes on, he goes past the fig tree, and that's taking place. And then it says in verse 15, and they came to Jerusalem, and Jesus went into the temple and began to cast them out that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. So I entitled this Cleaning Up the Temple. I had several other thoughts of how to entitle that passage, but I left them alone. I just decided to go with Cleaning Up the Temple. As Jesus goes into the temple, a sad scene is taking place. Here these men have begun to make the temple, the place of worship, into a place of merchandise. It's become a place to make money, and no doubt there was thieves. In fact, it's referred to that in verse 17. It became a den of thieves because they're exchanging money. They're no doubt making money off of that. I don't know if any of y'all have ever had to deal with exchanging money in different currencies. And I've had to deal with that before. And sometimes you lose a lot of money in those instances because people are just thieves and they're going to rob you. And those things were taking place. They were selling. They were making a profit out of people coming to worship and saying, well, if you're going to worship, you need to pay this. And you didn't bring a dove with you, so here, I'll sell you doves at a high price. But what are you going to do? You have to buy them or bring them. So instead you decide, I'm just going to take the money and do it and buy them when I get there. And they're here, and this is taking place. And I wonder, as I was reading through this, I went and I looked at the other accounts in Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, to try to find the other accounts as I dig into the information of what's going on here. And of course, Matthew and Luke were very close parallels to what Mark writes. But then you get to John, and John doesn't have it. But John has another account in chapter number 2. And I was doing some reading because the question came up, is the account in John chapter number 2 the same thing at the same time? Or is it different? And I was doing some research on it, and there seems to be just a little bit of a division on which one it is. If it's the same account in John chapter 2 as in Mark chapter 11, or if it's a different time. And so I did some research, and my opinion of it is that these are two different accounts in John 2 and then Mark 11. I think they're two different times. And I'll give you a couple reasons, or 4 reasons why I think that. This isn't in your notes, so you'll have to write this one in for yourself if you want to. But as he's cleaning up the temple, I was reading through and thinking about it. And if you go over to John chapter number 2, if you have your Bibles open, and you go to John chapter number 2, and we'll look at a few verses down through there as to what happens in that account. In John chapter number 2, it's verse 13 down through verse 17, so not a lot of verses here. But it says, and the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem and found the temple, those that sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the changers of money sitting, and when he had made a scourge of some cords, he made a whip. He drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, take these things hence, make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. And his disciples remembered that it was written, the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. So that's the account in John chapter number 2. Some of the things as we read John 2 and then also back in Mark 11, there's some slight differences in them. And we'll kind of glance at those here for a minute, and then we'll look and see, make your decision on which way you think it is. But I think they're two different accounts. In Mark chapter number 11, verse 15, we see Jesus, he came back into the temple, and I suspect that in verse 11, we notice Jesus went in and he observed what was going on. And then he left. I think that observation was to see if they were still doing what they had done back in John chapter 2. If John chapter 2 had taken place, Jesus had already drove them out one time, and now he's back again and seeing if they're doing it again. I wonder if that was one of the reasons why he went into the temple in verse 11, to see if they're back to their old habits again. And I thought that's probably very likely, because we as people, we do that. Jesus will convict us of sin, we'll drive it out, we'll get rid of it, and then next thing we know, we're back doing it again. And we wonder why. But as we go down through here, another reason, the timing seems to be at different ends of the ministry of Jesus. In John, it seems early in his ministry, and then as you go into Mark chapter 11, we know it's here at the end of his ministry. And then in John chapter 2, we see different statements made concerning after he overthrows the tables and drives them out. In John chapter 2, it says, "Take these things hence, make not my Father's house a house of merchandise." And in Mark chapter number 11, verse 17, it says, "Is it not written, my house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves." So we have two different statements being made there. And then the reaction of the Jews, there's two different reactions that take place. In John chapter 2, in verse 18, it says, "Then answered the Jews and said unto him, What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou doest these things?" What proof do you have? Why do you have the authority to do these things? Is what the Jews' response was to Jesus turning everything over in John chapter 2. And then in Mark chapter 11, you see the response, and we're going to look at these, but verse number 18, it says, "And the scribes and chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his doctrine." So it seems to me like these are two different accounts taking place in John chapter 2 and in Mark chapter 11. I thought that was interesting and wanted to share it with you. And you can put that down and go home and do a little studying on that and see where you come up. And if you find something more, you can share it with me. Also, John chapter 2, we have the whole whip, where Jesus makes a whip and he drives them out with that. We don't have that in Mark chapter 11. That's not shared here if it did happen. And so we go down through here and back to our message. That was a side message for you, by the way. So you can look at that one later. But back in verse 15, we see an immediate action taking place. Jesus goes into the temple, and the people there are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're not following along like they're supposed to be. They're not worshiping God. They've turned the temple into a place of money making. They've turned it into a den of thieves, as we have read earlier there in verse 17. They've taken the house of God and turned it into something that it's not supposed to be. And we see that today. It happens all the time. You go into some other churches, or if we can call them churches, and you think, how are they worshiping God in here? They're not worshiping the true God, I don't think, from what you see and the things happening there. And you wonder about it, don't we? We see some places like that and we think, I don't think they're worshiping the true God. But we see Jesus takes immediate action and begins to overthrow things and cast these people out, and overthrowing the money changers. And then even in verse 16 it says, "And he would not suffer that any man should carry any vessels through the temple." They must have been using the temple as a shortcut to get from one place in Jerusalem to another, and say, no, you need to go around the temple. This is a place of worship. This is not a traffic area. You're not supposed to be doing this. You're not honoring God in what you're doing. And Jesus was very upset concerning these things. And then we see verse 17, and we read it, but I put down exposing sin with truth. Exposing sin with truth here in verse 17. Jesus says, "And he taught, saying unto them, Is it not written, My house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer? But ye have made it a den of thieves." If you go over, that passage is found in Isaiah chapter 56 in verse number 7. It says there, "Even them will I bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be acceptable upon my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people." And yet they turned it into a den of thieves. Man, what a sad scene. what a arresting thought in our own minds to make sure we don't turn our church into a house of thieves, a den of thieves. Amen. We don't want to be that. But here Jesus exposes sin with the truth. He shares the truth of what it's supposed to be, and that when we see what things are supposed to be, sin is then exposed, is it not? I was talking to our Sunday school class this morning, and we were talking about works and faith and the difference between them. We were going through that. And I was talking about it, I said, as you drive into a town or on a new area, a new road, and maybe y'all don't do this, but I have because I got too many of these things. But when you drive in there, there's a sign on the right-hand side of the road. It's usually white, and it has numbers on it, and it tells you how fast you're allowed to go. And then if you go over that, there's somebody with a car with blue lights on it that reminds you that you went over that. And I got a few too many of those, so I decided to pay attention to those a little closer than I used to. That was a long time ago, back when I was bad. But when you expose sin with the truth, when the truth is revealed, when it's shown, sin, and you realize you've sinned. The officer comes over, knocks on your window, and they ask, do you know how fast you were going? No, sir, because I wasn't paying attention. That's the wrong answer. Not fast enough, you caught me. That's definitely not the right answer at all. But sin is exposed by truth, and that's what Jesus did here. And then verse number 18, we see the reaction, and we read this earlier, but I entitled this, we see the reaction of the guilty. Look at what verse 18 says. And the scribes and chief priests heard it, and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people were astonished at his doctrine. If the people begin to understand that this house is a house of prayer, and that merchandise shouldn't be sold, and what the chief priests were allowing to have go in there, which no doubt they were getting a little bit from, I would suspect, then they're going to lose money. Oh, that's going to ruin my livelihood. Look at what Jesus is doing. He is ruining what we've had a good thing set up here. We've been making lots of money. This has become very lucrative for us, and Jesus is ruining it. We need to get rid of him. And it shows the reaction of the guilty. I remember growing up, a friend of mine, he says, if you ever throw a rock in a pack of dogs, the one that got hit yelps the loudest. Oh, it's like, that's a really good statement. All right, it's a little country, but it's a really good statement. And that's what Jesus did here. When he did this, the guilty party exposed themselves. They reacted the most here. They showed the reaction of the guilty. They were very upset about it, to the point we're going to kill him. We're going to get rid of him. We need to destroy him because he is ruining a good thing, quote unquote, good thing that we have going on here. They're very upset with Jesus at this point. So we see the reaction of the guilty. And then as this takes place and we end this day with Jesus, and he's in here in the temple with these scribes and chief priests, and he's overthrown the tables, and what a scene that must have been. Can you imagine being the disciples, and here Jesus walks in and starts flipping tables over and driving animals out and telling people that they're not allowed to walk through here anymore, and commanding that scene and people doing that? Can you just imagine seeing that take place? The disciples there, then the chief priests getting all upset about this. And no doubt you could tell the chief priests were upset. People don't hide that very well. When you stir their honey pot or knock their honey pot over, and what they were expecting their gains to be, and you ruin that, people get very upset about that. No doubt the chief priests were like this. And as we close this scene up in verse 19, it says, and when eve was come, he went out of the city. And I just entitled that verse, Returning to Bethany. Here Jesus is, all this is taking place in the city, and no doubt this was not the time for him to be killed. It was not the time for him to be crucified. It's not the time of his death. And with the chief priests being extremely upset, no doubt they would hire assassins to try to kill Jesus, and they possibly were trying to go after him. And so Jesus decided that it was better if they went. And so when the evening time was come, he went out of the city, possibly back to Bethany, to stay in what I suppose would be back to Mary and Martha's house, to abide there during this time of Passover. So we have the beginning of his journey to the cross. We have his first entry into Jerusalem. And what a dynamic entrance it was. Here he is riding on a colt going in, the people crying Hosanna. And then the next day he comes back and throws out all the money changers and drives out all the animals. And I think Peter probably jumped in and helped, don't you? You know, Peter's a very rambunctious guy. I think he probably jumped in and said, all right, we finally get to do something. And I'm speculating there. It doesn't say Peter had anything to do with it. But if he didn't, he was in the corner cheering Jesus on. I guarantee you he was. He was happy to see that. He's probably smiling like you are right now. But what an amazing scene as Jesus enters in and begins to clean this place up and gets it straightened up. And isn't it so true when Jesus comes into our hearts and lives? He begins to clean it up just like he did there. And just a great little example I think of as I read there. Well, Lord willing, next week we'll continue into verse 20. And we'll look some more at this fig tree and what happens to it as we go down through there. So y'all don't read ahead. No, please do. Go ahead and read ahead. It's good for you. Go ahead and do some studying on this. What a great account. I know I didn't cover all of what was taking place as the other Gospels share it. But like I said earlier, I wanted to leave something for you to do this week. I didn't want to give you everything and you not have anything to read tomorrow or tonight when you go home. So take some time, read down through these accounts and what's taking place as we go through them. And what a wonderful thought to look at as Jesus begins his journey to the cross. Amen. Well, let's have a word of prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for tonight. Thank you for your word. Thank you for sharing with us this time as Jesus begins his journey to the cross and his first entrance and first few days there in Jerusalem. And we thank you, Lord, for giving us that account that we can learn from it and grow from it and understand who you are. We ask, Lord, that you would be with us as we go home tonight. And we ask these things in your name. Amen.
Amen.